Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea Podcast 1991 Retrospective, where we're all completely lucid and sane, and we talk about records from the insanely important year of 1991. Last year, we did not talk about anything. Last week, we talked about... Motherfucker, I was so well. Last week, we talked about
De La Soul, the legendary East
one.
Coast hip-hop band.
De La Soul is dead.
On an episode where we very thoroughly established its place in history.
We did, and we're going to do that for this album today, which is the Smashing Pumpkins, legendary grunge come shoegaze come alt-rock band with a very...
I really thought you did too.
Yeah, a lot of cum. With a very significant debut record that happened in this year. So obviously, in this retrospective, as I've touched on in previous retrospective intros, we talk about records that come in various points in the career of the artist. We're talking about in this retrospective. We have talked about records that are big breakthrough moments for artists that are 1 or 2 or 3 albums deep into their career. We've talked about records that are kind of the single significant work of an artist in the case of Spiderland. And we've talked about records that are kind of the swan song for an artist, like the Queen record that we talked about. And we also have talked about records that are auspicious debuts, Blue Lines being one, and this being another, if perhaps a little more overshadowed by subsequent records, but that I think only being all the more reason to spend a little more time on this record, give it the due that it doesn't necessarily get, and dig into some of the aspects of this record that I think are underappreciated and a little bit overlooked when considering the arc of the Smashing Pumpkins in the 90s and considering the year 1991 specifically, alt-rock and grunge in this year. I mean, you can draw straws on whether you consider this a grunge album. I do personally, but I could see maybe why some people might argue that it's not primarily grunge. I don't really know. I don't really care too much about the semantics, but it comes at an important juncture.
I mean, I was just gonna say that I don't consider it grunge, but that it is such a nebulous genre descriptor that it doesn't really matter.
I think
the fact that Nirvana and Pearl Jam are considered grunge both is like kind of baffling to me.
I think it's less maybe the way the term is used is less as a descriptor of sound and more of a signifier of status within a particular wave of music or a particular kind of time. The grunge wave is less to do with specific aesthetic signifiers and more to do with a cultural shift and the bands that were a part of that. And I mean, if we are to talk about grunge musical signifiers, I would argue that Gish is the Pumpkins album that has the most close attachment to that world, and they would kind of go beyond that into their own lane afterwards. But yeah, so
I also have a bit of trouble classifying anything not from the greater Washington area as grunge. Smashing Pumpkins is a Chicago band, long ways away from Seattle and that general area.
Yeah, that's a good point about the scene that I hadn't really thought about too. So grunge adjacent, let's say, one kind of important piece of connective tissue, I would say, is also the presence of Butch Vig as the producer of this record, who in many ways was, I think, undeniably the most influential rock producer of this year. 1991, his fingerprints being on 2 grunge staples, one of which is so ubiquitous I don't even need to mention it by name. Gish being the other is undeniably overshadowed, not just by this year's other big grunge / alt-rock releases, which were capital M moments for their respective bands, but by the work that Billy Corgan and his band would go on to do. In many ways, potentially controversial statement here, Smashing Pumpkins were the most exciting of the 90s early grunge alt-rock bands for the fact that Corgan's technical wizardry and incredibly claustrophobic wall of sound approach would give way to spacious, ambitious, sprawling masterworks as the decade progressed. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Jane's Addiction too, why not? They all made classic records, but arguably none had the sheer diversity or adolescent melodrama of the Pumpkins. And that I think is the genuine great appeal of them in this era and of Gish specifically as a record. For as integral as Vig's production approach was to a record like Nevermind, the ways in which he helped Corgan to achieve the wall of sound he desired for both Gish and Siamese Dream, or more so Siamese Dream, I suppose, is perhaps the contribution to 90s alternative rock that means the most to me, production-wise. Though it's easy to dismiss the walls of guitar on these early Pumpkins records as thin, oppressive, and overwhelming of the rest of the band, I think there's a lot more clarity in Gish in particular than gets acknowledged, as well as just a general sense of sonic density and variety. Yes, Corgan was a voracious prodigy who insisted on recording every single guitar and bass part himself, regardless of whether or not he composed it, treating his bandmates as tools more often than creative partners. And it's as such, it's easy to see the heavy dominance of the guitar and guitar sound in early Pumpkins as megalomaniacal or egotistical. And to that, I would say, yeah, that's the pleasure of it all. That's what makes it so thrilling. What makes 90s Pumpkins so great is the same thing that makes post-90s Pumpkins nigh on unbearable. It is the Billy Corgan show through and through, and he is as fascinating a personality in his weirdly infantile but also captivatingly unhinged performances as his shoegaze-inflected approach to rock sound is thrilling and enveloping. And it is also worth mentioning, for all my talk of the heft of the guitar sound, which obviously Corgan explores more radically on Siamese Dream, this is an album with terrific dynamics. Nowhere are the strengths of the Pumpkins in this nascent era better displayed than on the song I'd like to lead off our discussion with, Rhinoceros, which I think is the best song on the record, just technically virtuosic and thrilling in its rise and fall structure. I want to shout out as well, by the time you get to Billy's screeching, explosive solo halfway through this track, you are firmly in the grip of the man and you do not want him to let you go. I will shout out the fact that this record, obviously there are great guitar solos on subsequent Pumpkins records as well, but the clarity of the soloing and the sheer kind of ballistic energy of the soloing on this record as well is just fucking dope as shit. What do you guys think?
Rhinoceros in particular is top 10 Pumpkin songs for me to this day. It's just, I've listened to it probably 150 times in the last 6 months. I don't know why, really. It's literally just a song that I throw on when I have nothing else to listen to. It's like ASMR levels of intoxicatingly chilling. So to my mind, there are really three big guitar records that crossed over into the mainstream in the year 1991. Two of them are performed by the same guitar duo of Stone Gossard and Mike McCready, those two albums being Temple of the Dog and Pearl Jam's 10. And the other album of that trio is Smashing Pumpkins' Gish. Since the first Van Halen album, there had been a sort of desire to integrate this Yngwie Malmsteen style slap ass shredding all over all sorts of songs, and really only with these two records are they integrated into songs that are more than just adrenaline pumping fucking Saturdays or for the boys type energy songs of, Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, so on and so forth. Not to say that these are the first kinds of songs that have these amazing shredding solos in songs of substance, but that's kind of what I'm saying. It's just absolutely insane blues inspired riffing all over this record, and it's integrated in such fascinating and refreshing ways. I think it's important to highlight that just because this record gets kind of overlooked in general, but songs like the first two, I Am One and Siva, to the soloing on Rhinoceros, to the B side that was never released on the album, but was included on the soundtrack to Cameron Crowe's Singles, which was about the nascent grunge movement at the time, Drown, all of which have absolutely staggering solos. And I know what Tyler's about to say. It's that Drown should have been on this fucking album.
That
It just
and
really
it's
should have.
that and it would be it's better than any song on this album, and it well
Yes.
well, yeah, and it's also like a top 10 if not top 5 Pumpkin song, particularly, and I know you'll back me up on this, the alternative guitar solo 8-minute version, which is if you like guitars, then
Yes.
you will love this song. It's amazing.
And can I leap off of that and say, if you like guitars, boy, do I have the album for you. It's Gish. Congratulations. You have discovered the appeal of this record. And I don't mean to be like, I don't mean to be like all smooth brain Jake, but I'm going to bring him back here and just say that like the appeal of this album, James Iha. He's just the fucking best.
Let me point of clarification. Billy Corgan plays all the guitars on this.
No shit, really?
Yeah, this is all him.
I did not know that. Literally did not know that. Well, then it's Billy Corgan. And I guess that means for the first time in this podcast, I'm going to compliment Billy Corgan on something.
Yeah.
Just it's just such a world of difference. I mean, like I know we said we were going to talk about Late Era Pumpkins. I'm not going to talk about Late Era Pumpkins, but I just think the interesting thing here is that it's just like the contrast between careers is just like is that like the way they start here is just by having as much fucking impact as possible. These guitars are fucking razors. They sound serrated, and my God, what a like I know that the general consensus on this album is that generally speaking, it's like, oh, but you know, what about Siamese Dream? What about Adore? What about fucking Melancholy? And like, yeah, I love those albums, but I've really always had a soft spot for this one. And I know it's mainly because it's just like, you know, there are other, you can point at like more technically impressive things. You can point at more members of the band delivering more contributions to this. And sure, but I think that the energy here is A, maintained, and B, very comparable to something like Metallica's Kill 'Em All, or just there's just a very great fleshing out to the core of a sound here, and the way that they just sort of make it by these tight 10 tracks. I haven't heard Drown, but the way you all talk about it just kind of makes me think, yeah, this sounds like it would probably be something that I would agree should be put on the album. But as it stands, I still think that this record has a fan-fucking-tastic crop of songs. I think that I Am One and Siva are, I mean, not to imply that the album goes downhill from here, but those are my two favorite songs on the album. I just think this is opening 1-2 punch of fucking just like, especially if you're here for the guitars. If you're here for the guitars, these are the two songs that are going to absolutely fucking wallop you. And Rhinoceros too, of course, that extends to that. I think the cool thing about Rhinoceros is that it's a bit more measured in terms of the structure of the song. It's a bit less like, I mean, measurably, I guess, but like a tiny bit less immediate, but it results in like the structure of the song making that final third feel like it's fucking exploding, and it's awesome.
It's the same sort of structural track that he employs on Soma, which is another top 5 Pumpkin song as well, and that he can really make that heaviness hit by moving in a kind of slower way and kind of edging you towards it. I think it's more the loud quiet dynamic is more kind of integrated, interwoven here. But you know, but that's the thing about Smashing Pumpkins is their greatest strength is always the fact that they know how to be incredibly dreamy and just luscious, and they infuse that feeling into their heaviness. And that's, I guess, where the shoegaze comparison comes in as well.
Well, I just had something I wanted to add in particular about Rhinoceros being kind of our focal point of discussion here, and that song also has some like really excellent drum fills throughout it. And
Yeah.
I think that's, and this is something we've been kind of drip feeding, alluding to, that a lot of the rhythm section is amazing on this album.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm of the opinion that this is the compositional peak of the rhythm duo of Jimmy Chamberlin and Darcy Retzky. And I know that Billy overdubbed the bass, I know, but that's not to take away from Darcy's compositional skill. The bass lines on this record are just
The reason
Gabagool.
I think Chamberlain is better on Siamese Dream than he is on this record. But the reason that I
Reasonable.
have to give the rhythm section in general more credit on this record is that Darcy was not involved with the recording or composition of Siamese Dream.
Yes.
Because her and James Iha were in the process and in the aftermath of breaking up. So she just kind of fucked off for a while, and so did he. So it was, for that process, it was just Billy, Jimmy Chamberlin, and Butch Vig in the studio. But yeah, this is a staggering kick down the door introduction for this band's talents.
Yeah, and that difference in compositional diversity, I guess, between this record and Siamese Dream doesn't take away from Siamese Dream, but it does add to the real sense of diversity in the sound of this record. I want to shout out, you guys have talked about the kind of opening 3-track run, which is great, but I would say 4-track run because I fucking love the song Bury Me. I think it is one of the most just blistering songs of this record. I want to particularly shout out Corgan's soloing on this track, which is the most flashy and loud soloing on the whole record, and the way that he's just kind of going fucking ham at the same time that Chamberlain is blitzing through the kit like a fucking machine. And then the song has this really shoegazy second half that's my favorite part of this entire album. The track just balloons into this enormous and triumphant finale that Corgan is crooning over the top of. It's pure musical euphoria. And I see no one ever talking about this song. And it's like, fuck me, this song is amazing.
Oh, it's the sound of 90s alt rock as a whole. Just like the first minute of that song in general.
But just like where that song goes, it just takes me, I fall back in my chair every time. And so though it is eclipsed by what would come later for the band, as we've kind of talked about in terms of the culture, I obviously don't want us to come back to that criticism because it does get away from the purpose of this retrospective, which is to celebrate the moment of 91 and what it meant for these bands at that time. And frankly, I also want to say, I think there are gentler and simpler joys to Gish that also don't get fully appreciated. And also I want to say, just for the record, I think there's no duller criticism in the world than they would do better. You might be right, but are you really saying anything? Basically what I'm saying is, if you think they would do better, okay, explain what you mean about in terms of this record. What does this record hold back? And I do think that this record is imperfect. There are tracks I don't care for as much, and I think it does have some weak spots. But I do want to shout out that I think that generally speaking, the dreamier moments of Gish might feel initially pretty but insubstantive, but they're very tactfully deployed. They come after 4 tracks of the band thrashing at their most explosive, and so they're really well earned. And I also think that they're a lot more interesting than such a narrative would suggest, and I mean specifically the tracks Crush and Suffer. I want to shout out, again, even if it's played by Billy, I want to shout out the looping bass work of Darcy on Suffer, which I find absolutely captivating. And frankly, the band's softer and dreamier approach in a lot of these tracks feels more immediate and gripping than similar moments on later records. Suffer even has, I think, what I assume to be a flute solo, for fuck's sake. That kind of... that's shit that isn't really appreciated. They would never make another song like Suffer. And I've come to really, really dig it a lot. especially again for what it does at this point in the record. And these slower tracks don't meander either. They're locked in. Like I said, Chamberlain and Retsky, by way of Corgan's rhythm section composition, is tight as fuck. And Corgan's ethereal vocals are at their most sweet. So yeah, what do you guys think about the dreamier moments on this record, I guess?
Well, I'll start by saying the Crush is in my top 3, which, cause just, oh God, yeah, that's good stuff. I also want to note the closing track, Daydream, as I love the way that song is until it stops being the way that it is.
Yeah,
for some reason.
I like it until Billy Corgan starts singing on it.
Yeah, I like. That's another moment. Not the Corgan part, but everything that precedes it that just so perfectly captures a sound of the 90s to me. That being the slow dive, dream pop, shoegazy influenced stuff that sort of permeated in this early period. And I think it's really beautifully captured there until Corgan decides to fuck it up. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, like, if you ditch Daydream and throw in the 8-minute Drown as the closing track, this record gets like a full point bump.
Yeah.
Which, you know, like I said, I love some of those dreamier moments like Crush and Suffer. And I think the record benefits from not leaning on them too heavily. Again, the tightness of this record is really appreciated, especially considering obviously one of the joys of their later 90s records is the sprawling nature of them. But the tightness of this is really appreciated. And the variance as well. Like you do have Crush and Suffer, but then the band bring back the intensity on Snail, which is a great song, and they meld it beautifully with the dreaminess of the previous 2 tracks, such that it feels like the album is deepening rather than doubling back to the beginning. It's really compositionally smart, and I think it demonstrates how fully formed they were on Gish. I have come to move past my initial feeling over the years that the band are still finding their sound here. Now at 24, this sounds to me as assured as any debut I've ever heard. I want to shout out as well Chamberlain's fills, the rising intensity of the band in the back half of Snail, the massive climax of that song. It's a fucking fireworks display. And yeah, I love that track. I do feel that the record does step down a little bit from here. And I want to touch on briefly, I want to bring in something that Corgan has actually said about this record and comment on it. And that is that he says, the album is about pain and spiritual ascension. People ask if it's a political album. It's not a political album. It's a personal album. In a weird kind of way, Gish is almost like an instrumental album. It just happens to have singing on it. But the music overpowers the band in a lot of places. I was trying to say a lot of things I couldn't really say in kind of intangible, unspeakable ways. So I was capable of doing that with the music, but I don't think I was capable of doing it with words. That's Corgan. And that touches on, I think, if there is one weakness to this record, it is that there are parts where Corgan as a vocal presence is seldom more than just pleasant and gorgeous. And of course, that's enough. But there is an extent to which I think his limited commitment vocally here does hamper the lasting impact of the record, particularly in relation to the 91 alt rock contemporaries that this record brushes up against. Obviously, Billy has a great and unique voice, and that uniqueness is its greatest strength. But I do feel that there's a kind of sense of not, maybe if not hesitation, although maybe that is a good way of describing it, but he's not quite reaching the full extent of his dynamic range on this record. And so I would say if there's one point where this album is held back, it is in that particular regard.
That really was what brought down my enjoyment of this record a fair bit, is that I like what they're doing instrumentally, but then Billy Corgan and his fucking nasally voice comes over it, and I feel I'm taken out of the mood in a way. Like, I feel I can really get something just from the instrumentals on this album, but I'm just not crazy about the way he's integrated into the album itself.
I mean, I want to clarify. I think his contributions are great on vocally on songs like Siva and Rhinoceros, obviously, and Bury
Okay,
Me.
yeah.
But it's just more, I guess, in some of the later moments on the record where he
Yeah,
kind of feels
okay.
a bit more anonymous towards the end
I
as a performer.
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think, yeah, on some of the more heavier kind of rocky songs, I think that's where he's in his place. But on, yeah, a bit of the more dreamy, atmospheric stuff is kind of where that criticism is more evident for me, at least.
Yeah, I think a lot of that sort of reticence to fully embrace vocal duties does hamper the record in a few noticeable ways. I myself actually kind of prefer the dreamier stuff on this record in general. I think that's why Rhinoceros is the standout to me, is that it melds the two sides of the records pretty much perfectly. But largely speaking, I will take something like Crush over I Am One any day of the week. And you're right, it creates an interesting relationship because he is so much more locked in on songs like I Am One and Siva than he is on something like Tristessa. Or Tristessa's a bad example, Window Pane. But like Window Pane, I find so much more interesting, I guess. Less straight up enjoyable, but more interesting, almost in spite of the fact that he's not
Mm.
firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, that's not one of my favorite songs on the record, but I will give it that it's also that it is one of the most dramatic songs on the record. In its kind of progression, it's a longer track, and
Yeah.
it would I think that song would be significantly elevated if he were more, I guess, aggressive on it. I suppose I don't really know. It does feel though like with Daydream when he lets Darcy sing that it's like he cannot bear to let her have a whole song and he has to fucking jump
He
in.
has to wrestle it back.
God, the last minute of this album is just so bad. Just
Yeah.
just 1 minute of the album at the end that I really leaves the whole thing on a bum note. And it doesn't affect my feelings about the record that much at all. It's 1 minute. But it is like, man, if you just cut this or if you just put Drown after it, I wouldn't give a shit. But you know, that's nitpicking.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my final addition is that I guess yeah, it's good. I guess it maybe doesn't stick with me in the way I would like it to, but I think it does. What I think it does most importantly is it sparks within the listener an ambition for what comes next. Like, okay, these ideas are all interesting, and even if I have issues with it, I want to see where this goes. And I think that's the most important thing you can do with a debut, more
Yeah.
than even being an amazing record,
And
instilling that fire.
I think recording this pretty close to the actual 30th anniversary of this record's release, the idea of what kind of happens next is not even like necessarily talking about, well, obviously it is talking about the Pumpkins, but you could apply that to what was about to happen with the alt rock grunge explosion in the next few months. This record, I don't think anyone would hold this record above some of the classics that it is about to follow, although there's maybe one that's some of you would have a hot take about being worse than this, and that's fair. But it's almost like this is kind of a taster for what's about to come with, you know, I haven't heard it yet, but Temple of the Dog, 10, you know, Bad Motorfinger, etc. This is like the prologue, basically. And that's not to say that there aren't important records in this vein that preceded. I'm sure there are. But in terms of the arc of this portrait we're painting of this year, this is very much like the entree. It's a great fucking entree, but it is the entree before we get to the main course. And I like the fact that it's that. I'm glad it comes at this point in the year so that we can build in our anticipation towards the explosion that would happen in August and September of this year. So that's one way in which I think it's very valuable and doesn't diminish its value in any way. It's just, that's part of the joy of it to me. And it is underrated and it's underappreciated. And it's easy to see why, because of that, because of what was about to immediately follow in the grunge and alternative rock wave. But, you know, you need to have records like Gish. You need to have these gems that you discover when you dive deeper and when you pay more attention to stuff that isn't, you know, Nevermind or whatever. And for that reason, that's why I think it's so important to have this record in the retrospective, because there was something in the air at this point in the year. There was just a feeling that something massive was about to happen. And Gish is as beautiful a representation of that feeling as anything, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Favorite tracks and ratings. Jake, why don't you lead us off?
Your favorite tracks are I Am One, Siva, and Snail. Least favorite track is Daydream. I give the album an 8 out of 10.
For me, 3 favorite tracks are Rhinoceros, I Am One, and Bury Me. Least favorite is Daydream. I'd give it a 6 out of 10.
My 3 favorites are Rhinoceros, Crush, and if I can be pedantic, the parts of Daydream where Darcy sings. If I can't be pedantic, I'd probably say Siva. My least favorite, if I can be pedantic, is the part in Daydream where Corgan sings. If I can't be pedantic, probably Tristessa. And it's an 8.
8, fantastic. Saoirse gives it a 6.5. My 3 favorite tracks are Rhinoceros, Bury Me, and Snail. No, actually Suffer. Throw Suffer in there because I really dig that track. It's really grown on me. Least favorite is probably Tristessa as well. And I'm going to give this record a 7.5, which gives us an average of 7.2. And other records that we have given a 7.2 on this podcast collectively include Fucked Up's Dose Your Dreams, Jason Isbell's Reunions, and Shoo Shoo's Oh No. So fantastic. Solid company, I would say, personally. And so Jake, you won't be aware of this, but we just made a last minute addition to our retrospective lineup thinking about this record. Our next, because we're about to take a break from the retrospective, but we decided to do one more before we take a bit of a break. And the next record we're going to cover in the retrospective is the grunge supergroup of members of Soundgarden and Pearl Jam, Temple of the Dog. Featuring a band that features Chris Cornell, Stone Gossard, Jeff Ament, Mike McCready, Matt Cameron, and Eddie Vedder as a guest vocalist as well. I've not heard this album, but it came out in April of 1991. So even as a part of this impending grunge wave, it even precedes Gish. So we're obviously going to talk about it before we talk about either of the actual Pearl Jam or Soundgarden records that came out this year. And so that's going to be the next record in our 1991 retrospective series. So stick around for that. But let us know in the meantime what you think of Gish, what you think of its place in the 1991 grunge / alternative rock wave, how you think it sits in the Smashing Pumpkins discography, and your general feelings. Let us know in the comments below.
Well, and as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, MTV. I want my MTV.